a secret buried in ice for over a century, is finally waking up. What Jack and Ethan discovered in the Alaskan wilderness will rewrite history and change everything we thought we knew about the sky. Before we begin, subscribe, like this video, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The truth is waiting beneath the ice. The wind carved across the Alaskan Rockies with a violence that felt almost personal, an endless, howling force that stripped heat from skin and sound from the world. Snow didn't fall here. It attacked, each grain a needle of ice that stung exposed flesh and rattled against fabric. Jack Whitmore leaned forward into the gale, one hand gripping the strap of his pack, the other shielding his eyes from the brightness of the frozen expanse ahead. The sky was an iron sheet, heavy and unmoving, the pale sun barely visible behind a veil of frozen haze. They had been out on the glacier for nearly a week, traveling from ridge to ridge on a research mission funded by the University of Anchorage. Ice cores, drone mapping, seismic readings. Most days followed the same routine. Yet from the moment Jack awoke that morning, he sensed something different in the air, something unsettling in the unnatural stillness of the mountains. Behind him, Ethan Cole trudged through the snow like a silent shadow. His hood was pulled low, frost clinging to the edges of his scarf. Every step sank deep into the crusted ice, leaving a trail of impressions that the wind quickly began to erase. Ethan had complained often during the trip, about the cold, about the endless quiet. But today he said nothing. The mountains felt too watchful, too quiet, as if the entire landscape was frozen, not just by the temperature, but by anticipation. By noon they reached a narrow ridge overlooking a deep valley. The wind eased slightly, and Ethan stopped to tap at the drone monitor strapped to his chest. "Signal's weak again," he muttered. "This wind is killing the GPS." Jack stepped beside him, squinting at the flickering screen. The feed jumped and jittered, the camera momentarily swallowed by the bright, blinding whiteness of the glacier below. They waited for the image to stabilize. For a long moment, there was nothing but glare and shifting shadows. Then something glinted. Sharp, metallic, not rock, not ice. A flash of reflected sunlight, half buried under the blue sheen of the glacier far across a wide crevasse. Ethan's brow furrowed. "Please tell me you saw that." Jack's pulse kicked hard in his chest. "I saw it. Mark the coordinates." Ethan dropped a pin on the digital map. The coordinates blinked on the screen, impossibly far across the broken valley. A long, treacherous descent separated them from the mysterious shape, but Jack felt a pull stronger than caution. Whatever lay beneath the ice was not a natural formation. They began descending toward the valley, moving from ridge to ridge along the narrow paths carved through centuries of frozen wind. The glacier crackled beneath their boots, the deep, resonant sound of shifting ice echoing up from unseen depths. Every so often the air carried a faint rumble, almost like distant thunder, except the sky above remained dry and unmoving. Hours passed. The light dimmed, turning from silver to a dull steel gray. When they finally reached the lowest point of the valley, they paused to catch their breath. Jack scanned the horizon until he spotted it, the shimmering curve again, rising just barely above the surface of the snow. It was larger than the drone footage had suggested. They approached slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. The world was completely silent now, as if the mountain itself was holding back a breath. The closer they came, the clearer the shape became. It wasn't jagged like rock, it wasn't rough like weathered equipment. It was smooth, it was curved, and it was unmistakably metal. Jack knelt and pressed his gloved hand against the ice covering the surface. Through the translucent blue, he could see lines long, rib-like beams, forming a structure that did not belong to nature. "Look at these frames," he murmured. This isn't debris or scrap. It's part of something massive. Ethan crouched beside him, staring through the frozen crust. Is that what I think it is? No way. It can't be. Jack didn't answer, but his silence spoke louder than words. The object beneath the ice rose in an elegant arc, the metal darkened by age but still unmistakably intact. It stretched farther than their lights could reach. Even distorted by the layers of frozen water, its outline suggested something engineered, constructed, something that had no business being here. A cold knot tightened in Jack's stomach. Legends whispered among historians flickered through his thoughts. Failed expeditions, classified prototypes, strange sightings of airships that vanished over the ocean. Most were dismissed as myths, rumors lost to time. But myths didn't leave behind metal skeletons preserved under glaciers. They stood staring until the cold forced them to move. With daylight fading faster than expected, they set up their tent a short distance away, anchoring it against the rising wind. The moment they zipped the flap shut, the storm returned with ferocity, slamming against the canvas like a beast clawing to get in. Inside, their tiny heater offered only a weak halo of warmth. Jack lay awake long after Ethan drifted into exhausted sleep. The wind outside rose and fell in mournful cries, but beneath the noise there was something else, something deeper. A groan, a slow, resonant vibration, the glacier shifting far below. Jack listened intently, his heart pounding. It wasn't unusual for glaciers to move, to creak under their own weight. But this sound felt different. Intentional somehow, rhythmic. Almost like... He sat up, breath caught in his throat. Like something knocking. From deep within the ice. He held still, listening, as the noise faded into the storm. For minutes he didn't move. He wasn't sure if Ethan had heard it too, and he didn't wake him. Some things were harder to believe when spoken aloud. Eventually he lay back down, staring into the dim glow of the tent lantern. Sleep refused to come. Tomorrow they would reach the object. Tomorrow they would find out what was buried under 100 years of ice. And as the last hours of night dragged on, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that whatever waited beneath the glacier wasn't just lost. It was waiting. The morning light barely touched the valley when Jack and Ethan broke camp, their breaths forming quick clouds in the brittle air. The temperature had dropped overnight, and the world felt sharper, every sound clearer, as though the storm had carved the landscape into something new. The glint of metal they had seen the day before was hidden under a fresh layer of snow, but its presence still pulsed beneath the ice like a heartbeat. Their path led upward through a twisting maze of ridges and narrow crevasses. Wind funneled between the blue walls, whistling through the frozen corridors. Each step had to be deliberate. Here the ground could split open without warning, revealing endless blackness beneath. The glacier groaned occasionally, deep, resonant sounds that rolled through the cold like the shifting of a massive creature. "This place hates us," Ethan muttered, gripping his axe as he hauled himself up the side of a jagged formation. "It's not personal," Jack said, though his voice lacked the confidence to match his words. "It's just old." They climbed for hours, stopping only when the wind became too strong to stand. Snow brushed past them in horizontal sheets, stinging their faces even through their masks. Despite the danger, Jack felt a strange pull guiding him forward. Every time the wind parted long enough to show the shattered valley below, he caught glimpses of the metallic curve buried beneath the glacier. By midday, the storm eased. A pale glow seeped through the clouds. The route ahead opened into a wide shelf of ice overlooking a deep basin. And there, at the bottom of the slope, half swallowed by centuries of frost, lay the object. Closer now, the structure was breathtaking, not debris, Not a wing or a propeller or any familiar aircraft design. A long, ribbed hull curved and elegant arched from beneath the snow, its surface gleaming faintly in the weak light. Ethan let out a low whistle. "That's huge." Jack nodded silently. Even from a distance, the scale was staggering. The hull alone was the length of a small building. Snow had filled every crack, turning the entire structure into a ghostly, half-frozen monument. At the front of the hull, Jack could see the distorted shape of a gondola jutting from the glacier. One side of it was crushed by ice, but much of its frame remained intact. They began the descent, moving slowly, driving their crampons deep into the slope. As they crossed the final stretch of the basin floor, Jack reached out and brushed snow off a narrow section of exposed metal. His fingers traced faded, frost-covered letters. "H," Jack whispered. "S." He scraped harder, revealing the full inscription. "HMS Resolute 1910. The world seemed to stop breathing. Ethan froze beside him. "Jack, that's impossible. There was never a British airship out here. Never." Jack didn't answer. His mind raced through everything he knew, the failed prototypes, the abandoned projects, the rumors of a secret pre-war program. Nothing matched the sheer size of this vessel. Nothing explained its presence in the unforgiving heart of Alaska. They circled the gondola, searching for an entrance. Snow had sealed the windows, turning them opaque. The metal skin of the craft had fused with centuries of ice, making it difficult to distinguish where the ship ended and the glacier began. After several minutes of searching, Ethan stopped at a small, barely visible seam in the hull. "Doors here," he said, bringing his face close to the frost-coated surface. "It looks jammed." Jack dug the edge of his axe into the seam. "We can break it." It took nearly an hour. Each strike of Ethan's axe rang out like a gunshot, echoing through the frozen valley. Chunks of ice shattered around them, their breath rising in white plumes. Jack wedged his pick deeper, prying at the metal. His arms burned with effort. Each crack of the ice sounded like the glacier protesting. Finally, with a scraping cry that vibrated through their bones, the hinge snapped. The hatch creaked open, releasing a gust of air colder than anything they'd felt outside. It smelled of rust, dust, and something ancient. Something that hadn't been disturbed in 100 years. Jack aimed his flashlight inside. The beam illuminated a narrow corridor lined with frost-covered metal. Ice clung to every surface. Shadows from broken pipes and dark cables stretched across the walls like frozen vines. The silence inside the ship was suffocating, dense as the ice itself. "After you," Ethan said, but his voice was barely more than a whisper. Jack stepped through the hatch, his boots crunching against the frozen floor. The corridor opened into a wider chamber, what must have been a control room. Shattered gauges were frozen mid-air, trapped in thick layers of ice. Levers covered in frost stuck out at strange angles. Old wires dangled from the ceiling like the remains of veins. At the center of the cockpit sat a leather-bound chair, bolted firmly to the floor. The seat was cracked, stiff with frost, and resting on it, half fused into the ice, was a weathered leather satchel. Jack approached it slowly. "Do you see this?" he breathed. Ethan knelt beside him. "It's in good condition, amazingly good." Using their tools, they chipped around the satchel until it came free with a brittle crack. Jack turned it over carefully. The leather was stiff, but intact. The buckle, tarnished green, still held firm. "We'll thaw it back at camp," Jack said. "Whatever's inside, it matters." They moved deeper into the ship. A narrow walkway led to a navigation room. The table inside was covered beneath a flawless sheet of ice, so clear Jack could see the objects below: rolled maps, a compass, pencils scattered, as if abandoned mid-task. Ethan pressed his gloved hand against the ice. It's like the crash happened yesterday. Jack's light swept the walls, and a glint caught his attention. He walked to the far corner, where a cylindrical metal tube was bolted into the structure. He wiped away the frost and saw faint lettering worn by time. This might hold documents, Jack said. Help me open it. Ethan pulled out his multi-tool. The bolts were old but yielded with effort. When he slid the final screw free, the lid cracked open with a sharp hiss of released frost. Inside was a rolled bundle, wrapped tightly in oilcloth. Jack stared at it, heart pounding. We take this with us. They documented as much as they could, photographing the layout, the instruments, the ice formations. But the deeper sections of the gondola had collapsed long ago, leaving only dark fissures where metal had bent under the weight of time. On their way out, Jack paused at a plaque partially buried under a heap of frozen debris. He brushed it clean, revealing engraved letters. HMS Resolute Royal Air Corps, 1910. The moment felt heavy like discovering a headstone. When they stepped back outside, the daylight was nearly gone. Snow fell in soft, eerie sheets, as if the sky were trying to conceal the ship once more. Ethan stood silent, staring at the massive hull buried beneath the glacier. This thing, he whispered. It's been here for over a century. Jack nodded, his breath fogging the air. And no one knew. They climbed away from the wreck, the ship gradually disappearing behind them, swallowed again by storm and shadows. By the time they reached the ridge, the wind was rising, roaring through the valley with renewed fury. They pitched their tent quickly, hands numb, faces raw from the cold. Inside, their headlamps cast dim circles of light on the tent walls. Jack set the frozen satchel near the heater, watching frost melt in tiny rivulets. The metal cylinder lay beside it. Ethan leaned back, exhaustion in his voice. What do you think's inside? Jack stared at the satchel, the weight of their discovery pressing down on him like a physical force. Whatever it is, he said quietly, it's the truth. The wind howled outside, rattling the canvas like something desperate trying to get in. The glacier groaned beneath them, a deep, sorrowful sound that made the air vibrate. Jack listened to the storm and thought of the men who had flown the Resolute men, who had been swallowed by ice and silence long before the world ever knew their names. Tomorrow they would open the satchel. Tomorrow the past would finally speak. The storm had burned itself out by the time Jack and Ethan began their trek back toward the research station. The sky was a washed-out gray, the kind of flat, colorless light that made it impossible to tell time by the sun. Their bodies moved on autopilot, muscles sore, lungs aching from days of thin, frozen air. In Jack's pack, wrapped carefully in layers of fabric, the satchel and the metal cylinder seemed to weigh more than the rest of his gear combined. They didn't talk much on the way back. Every now and then, Ethan would glance at the ridge line, as if expecting to see the bowed curve of the hull reappear above the glacier. But the mountain had already closed its jaw around the secret again. Snowdrifts slid over the ice like slow waves, erasing their tracks and any sign they'd ever been there. 3 days of walking and climbing blurred into one long sheet of cold and silence. When the antennas of the research station finally appeared on the horizon, faint against the pale sky, Ethan let out a breath that came out half laugh, half groan. Thought I'd never be happy to see that ugly building again, he muttered. Jack didn't answer. His eyes were on the ground, on each careful step. His thoughts were back inside the hull, on the frozen control panels, the leather chair, the plaque with the ship's name. On the men whose last moments were written into the walls of that place. Inside the station, the blast of heated air made his skin sting. The warmth was almost painful after so long in the open. A few colleagues stepped out of side rooms, surprised. No one had expected them back for at least another week. Questions started immediately. How did it go? Get the samples? Why do you look like you've seen a ghost? We'll debrief later, Ethan said quickly. We need the lab, now. They shut themselves in the small equipment room they'd converted into a makeshift analysis space. The air hummed with the sound of old fluorescent lights and the deeper buzz of the station's aged generators. Jack set his pack on the table and opened it with careful fingers. The leather satchel had fully thawed. It was still stiff, but no longer fused with ice. Jack unlatched the corroded buckle and peeled the flap back. Inside, wrapped in cracked, yellowed paper, were several folded sheets and a small, bound notebook. The cover of the notebook was worn, the edges frayed, but when Jack opened it, the ink inside was surprisingly clear. A neat script ran across the top of the first page. Flight log, HMS Resolute. Captain Edward Hargrove. Ethan exhaled slowly. Oh my God. Jack flipped to the first entries. Dates, coordinates, weather notes. Descriptions of engine performance, crew morale, altitude. It read like the heartbeat of a journey. April 12th, 1910, Jack murmured. Departure from Bristol complete. Crew in high spirits, engine steady. We make for Newfoundland at first light. Ethan leaned over his shoulder. This is real. All of it. They moved through the pages together, reading line after line. The early entries were confident, almost exuberant. The crew celebrated clear skies, rising altitudes, the thrill of crossing open ocean with nothing beneath them but distance and faith. Later, the tone began to shift. April 14th, strong headwinds, fuel usage higher than projected, crew fatigued but determined. April 15th, ice forming on external frame, adjusted altitude, engine strained. Jack's finger traced the ink as he read. April 16th, land sighted at dawn, we crossed the ocean. The words hung there for a moment, suspended between them. Years before anyone in the world believed such a thing was possible. Years before any of the names taught in flight history classes were even associated with the Atlantic. They did it, Ethan whispered. Quietly, secretly, and nobody ever knew. Jack turned another page. The handwriting grew frantic, lines slanting more steeply. Attempted return delayed by storm. Crew exhausted, fuel low, compass erratic. If the wind turns again, we may not hold course. The final entry was barely legible, the ink smeared as if written with shaking, half-frozen hands. Engines lost, ice on frame increasing, crew freezing. If anyone finds this, tell them we made it. Jack closed the book slowly. For a moment he couldn't speak. We will, he said at last quietly. We'll tell them. The cylinder held more than either of them expected. Inside the oilcloth were blueprints of the Resolute's frame and gondola, letters stamped with the Royal Air Corps insignia, and documents marked with heavy black, confidential stamps. One letter, signed by Major Thomas Avery, sent a chill down Jack's spine as he read. Upon success of the mission, official recognition will be granted under controlled circumstances at the discretion of the government. In the event of failure, all records pertaining to the Resolute and her crew are to remain strictly unacknowledged. Failure will remain unrecorded, Ethan repeated under his breath. So if they disappeared, that was it. No search, no memorial, nothing. Just gone, Jack said. Erased. They spent hours scanning pages with the station's aging equipment, sending encrypted copies to the university servers, logging each document with shaking hands. The more they read, the clearer the picture became. The Resolute had been built in secret to do what the rest of the world publicly called impossible. Cross the Atlantic. Prove that the sky could span an ocean just as ships had spanned water for centuries. The ship had left England in silence, flown into the unknown and succeeded. And when it didn't return, the silence simply deepened. News of the discovery didn't leak. It detonated. Within days, the research station was flooded. Historians from the university arrived first, followed by government representatives from Anchorage, then journalists, then people with no clear purpose beyond cameras and credentials. Satellite uplinks that had struggled to carry simple data files now strained under the weight of live interviews and international calls. Jack watched the chaos from the edges at first. He saw Ethan pulled into conversations, overheard phrases like historic moment, rewriting textbooks, global press conference. Men in suits stood around printouts of the logbook pages, pointing at lines as if they could own them. Lab tests confirmed what the documents claimed. The paper, the ink, the stamps. All dated to the early 1900s. The engineering of the hull visible in the photos matched nothing German or American. It fit only one place, an undocumented branch of British airship development. The British government confirmed nothing explicitly, but they said enough. Statements about long-lost experimental projects, about a brave crew whose story was never told. The phrase, the true first transatlantic flight, began to appear in headlines. One evening, Jack and Ethan watched a live broadcast in the mess hall. The grainy TV screen showed a polished anchor standing beside a projected image of the Resolute's log. "Today," she said, voice heavy with awe, "we can finally say that the first successful transatlantic flight did not belong to those we thought. It belonged to a ship and a crew whose names were buried in ice for over a century. HMS Resolute, Captain Edward Hargrove, and his men." The room erupted in applause. People clapped, some even cheered. Ethan smiled, eyes bright. "We did it," he said. "We brought them back." Jack didn't clap. His gaze stayed fixed on the screen, on the close-up of the last line of the log. "Tell them we made it." It no longer sounded like a victory cry. It sounded like something written by a man freezing to death, desperate for someone, anyone, to know that his life's purpose hadn't ended in failure. In the days that followed, interest hardened into ambition. Private companies offered funding for a full excavation. Government officials discussed logistics. Maps were spread out, weather models reviewed. There were proposals to cut the gondola free from the ice, transport it by helicopter, and reconstruct it in a climate-controlled museum in London. "It deserves to be seen," one British representative said in a call Jack overheard. "The world should stand under it and understand what these men did." Ethan agreed. "This is bigger than a crash site on a glacier," he argued one night in their small shared cabin. Papers and printed emails lay scattered across the table between them, illuminated by the yellow glow of a single lamp. "If we don't bring it out, most people will never connect to it. They need to see the ship, walk around it, look at the instruments, feel it." Jack sat opposite him, elbows on his knees, eyes on the floor. "It's their grave," he said softly. Ethan's jaw clenched. "It's history. It's both." "You're romanticizing it," Ethan snapped. "They flew to prove something. They risked everything to change what people believed was possible. You think they'd want to stay buried, where no one can ever learn from what they did?" Jack lifted his gaze. "I think they'd want to be remembered," he said, "not turned into a spectacle. You're being dramatic, and you're not being careful enough." Silence pressed in. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. Somewhere in the station, someone laughed too loudly, a jagged sound in the tense air. "You can't protect them from the world," Ethan said finally. "The story is out. The government's involved. This isn't just ours anymore." Jack looked at the scattered pages on the table ink written by men who had known they might die unknown. "Truth doesn't belong to people who want to sell it," he said. the air between them iced over. Ethan stood abruptly, pushing his chair back. "You're tired," he muttered. "Take a night, sleep. Maybe you'll think clearer in the morning." But Jack didn't sleep. He went back to the lab instead. Most of the station was quiet by then. The constant murmur of voices had faded to the occasional distant cough or clatter of equipment. Jack sat alone at one of the metal tables, lit only by the bright, clinical glow of the overhead lamps. He went through the documents again, slower this time. Not as a scientist cataloging evidence, but as a man reading the last words of people he would never meet. One scrap of paper was tucked between folded blueprints, almost missed. It wasn't stamped or signed with rank. The handwriting slanted differently than the captain's log, a little messier, more hurried. Jack smoothed it out carefully. "We can see the ice now," the letter began. "The captain says we are off course, but he does not show it in his face. We are tired. It is cold in a way we did not think possible. Some of the men whisper that we will not be remembered if we fail. I do not care about the papers or the government. I only hope that someone will know what we did." Farther down the page, the last line stopped Jack's breath. "We did not cross the ocean for fame. We did it so that someone, someday, might know it could be done." He read it twice, 3 times. The words were not written for newspapers or plaques. They were not written for politicians or sponsors. They were written by a man freezing in an airship, staring at a white horizon, and thinking about the possibility that his life's greatest act would vanish into nothing. Jack realized then that the story had never truly belonged to governments or media. It belonged to those men and to the promise made in that freezing cabin. Someone, someday, not crowds, not headlines, just someone. He closed his eyes and exhaled. Ethan was wrong about one thing. This wasn't just history. It was responsibility. By morning, Jack's decision had hardened into something immovable. He packed quietly in their small cabin thermal clothing, food rations, extra fuel for a small stove, a handheld recorder, printed photographs of the logbook pages, and a flat, wrapped object he'd been working on in the station's workshop, a small wooden plaque. He carved the names himself, letter by letter: Edward Hargrove, Thomas Avery, Samuel Brooks. Others copied from the log. Every stroke of the knife felt like an act of apology. Beneath the list he carved one final line: "They crossed the ocean before the world was ready to believe." He wrapped the plaque in cloth and slid it into his pack. Outside, the sky was still dark, only a thin strip of pale light showing where the mountains met the horizon. The air bit at his cheeks. He walked toward the trucks parked near the station's edge, his boots crunching over frozen gravel. "Jack." He stopped. Ethan stood a few yards away, hair messy, eyes tired, a jacket thrown over hastily. "You're going back," Ethan said. It wasn't a question. Jack turned to face him. "I need to see it one last time," he replied. "The weather's turning again. You've seen the reports. This isn't a hike, it's—" "A promise," Jack said. "We woke them up, Ethan. Now everyone wants a piece of them, a story, a relic, a brand. Before that happens, I need to give them something that's just for them. By freezing to death on a glacier?" Ethan's voice cracked. "How does that help anyone?" Jack's gaze softened, but his resolve didn't. "If we let this become another exhibit, another product, then what did we really discover? A trophy? Content? Or men who gave everything for one impossible dream?" Ethan swallowed hard. "You can't stop this machine. Even if you go back, even if something happens, the world isn't going to forget now." "I know," Jack said quietly. "I'm not trying to stop the world. I'm trying to make sure that when it looks up at that sky and says their names, it understands that this place," he jerked his head toward the distant mountains, "is a grave, not a theme park." For a moment, Ethan said nothing. The only sound was the soft whistle of wind over the snow. "You're being selfish," Ethan whispered. "You're leaving me to deal with all of this alone." "I'm trusting you," Jack corrected gently. "You'll be here when they ask what to do next. You'll remember what this really was." Ethan's jaw worked. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "Jack." But there was nothing left to say that wouldn't break something between them. Jack lifted his pack onto his shoulders, the straps biting into his coat. He took one last look at Ethan, then turned toward the pale line of the mountains. The sky above them was the color of steel. Somewhere beyond those ridges, beneath a frozen sea of ice, the HMS Resolute slept. Jack walked toward it. The wind picked up, carrying the sharp taste of snow. The past had been found. Now it had to be laid to rest. The cold felt different this time. Not just sharp or bitter or deep, but purposeful, like something that wanted him gone. The sky over the Alaskan range hung low and colorless, an endless ceiling of gray pressing down on jagged peaks. Jack moved through the snow with steady, methodical steps, breath burning in his lungs, straps biting into his shoulders. Behind him, the research station had vanished from sight. Ahead, only white. He knew the route by memory now, the rise of that ridge, the angle of the valley below, the way the wind shifted as you approached the basin where the glacier curved in on itself like a frozen wave. The storm had buried their old tracks, erased every sign that two men had ever walked this path together. Now there was only one. Hours passed in a quiet that felt heavy rather than peaceful. The only sounds were the scrape of his crampons and the soft crunch of his boots breaking the surface of new snow. The weight in his pack tugged between his shoulders, the recorder, the printed photos, the small stove, the food, and the plaque. The plaque felt heaviest of all. By the time he reached the high vantage point above the basin, daylight was thinning. A muted, bluish glow seeped through the clouds, turning the world into a desaturated dream. Jack stopped near the edge of the ridge and drew a slow breath. Below him, half-buried and ghost-like, lay the hull of the HMS Resolute. Snow had done its work. What had once been a distinct metallic curve was now a softer shape, blurred by fresh drifts. The gondola was almost completely swallowed. Only a hint of its broken frame remained exposed. The glacier had tried its best to take the ship back. Jack descended carefully, every step sending small avalanches of powder sliding down the slope. The closer he came, the more the hull emerged again from beneath its shroud, an immense, silent form pressed into the ice, as if the mountain itself were holding it down. At the base of the slope, he stopped in front of the forward section of the hull and let the silence settle around him. The air here felt different, thicker, as if the space itself remembered. Slowly he shrugged off his pack and knelt in the snow. Fingers stiff inside his gloves, he unwrapped the cloth around the plaque and lifted it out. It was small compared to the ship and the glacier and the mountains, just a slab of wood, sanded smooth, the names carved carefully into its surface. Edward Hargrove, Thomas Avery, Samuel Brooks, and the rest of the crew, letter by letter, line by line. Beneath them, the final inscription. They crossed the ocean before the world was ready to believe. Jack stared at the words for a long moment, the wind tugging lightly at his jacket. Then he took his ice axe and drove it into the surface of the glacier. The sound rang out, clear and bright, echoing back from the surrounding walls of ice. He carved a narrow trench into the frozen crust until it was deep enough to hold the plaque upright. Snow dusted his coat and shoulders as he worked. His breath came harsh and uneven, but he didn't stop until the plaque stood in place, its bottom edge wedged into solid ice. He stepped back, studying it. It looked impossibly small in the vastness of the glacier. Yet something about the names, the simple honesty of the line beneath them, made the space around it feel anchored. For the first time since they'd opened the hatch of the Resolute, Jack felt the crushing weight in his chest loosen, just a fraction. He turned toward the hull. The entrance they had forced before was sealed again, under a skin of ice and snow. The glacier had smoothed over their intrusion, hiding the wound as if nothing had happened. Jack climbed up the slope beside it and peered through a narrow gap where the metal had bent inward. Faint blue light filtered through the ice, casting the interior in a dim, underwater glow. He couldn't see much. The shadow of the control room, the curve of the ceiling, but he didn't need to. He could imagine it all. The captain in his chair, hands numb, eyes on failing instruments. The crew, breath frosting the air, huddled in thick coats that couldn't keep out that kind of cold. The sound of engines shuddering, then dying. The last, long silence. Jack rested his forehead lightly against the frozen metal. "You made it," he whispered. "The world knows now." His words hung in the still air. Somewhere high above, the wind shifted. It swept across the open glacier with a deep, low sound that rose and fell like a long sigh. For a moment, it changed pitch, just enough that he thought he heard something else riding on it. Laughter. Voices. A faint, distant hum like engines turning over. Jack closed his eyes, letting the noise pass through him. He didn't know if he believed in signs or ghosts. But right then it felt less like he was standing alone, and more like he was standing in the presence of something awake. Clouds gathered thicker over the peaks. The light dimmed from pale blue to steel gray. Snowflakes began to drift down again, light at first, then more insistent. He couldn't stay long. Jack climbed back down to a small rise, a short distance from the plaque. There he set up his tent, anchoring it firmly with lines and stakes drilled into the ice. The routine felt slower than usual, his movements heavier, but also strangely peaceful. When the tent was secure, he pulled out the handheld recorder from his pack and turned it on. The small screen lit up, casting a square of weak light over his gloves. He pointed the lens toward the hull and the plaque nearby. On the tiny screen, the scene looked almost unreal. A ship buried in a frozen sea, a wooden marker standing guard. Jack took a breath, tasting cold metal and snow. "This is Jack Whitmore," he said quietly. His voice sounded calm in his own ears, almost detached. "If anyone finds this recording, I'm at the site of the HMS Resolute, on the glacier where it came to rest." He shifted slightly, bringing the plaque into full view. "I'm leaving something here for them," he continued. "For Captain Hargrove and his crew. They crossed an ocean before the world believed it was possible. They did what all of us spend our lives chasing, something impossible that only becomes truth when someone is brave enough to try." He swallowed, his throat tight. "We woke their story up. That was our part. But this place, this ship, this is their grave. It's not a stage or a trophy or a museum exhibit. It's a promise." The wind picked up for a moment, a low, constant rush against the recorder's microphone. When it quieted, Jack went on. "If anyone finds this, tell them we kept the promise," he said. "Tell them they weren't forgotten." He lowered the recorder slightly, letting the camera linger on the plaque one last time. Then he clicked it off and slipped it inside his jacket, close to his chest. Snow began to fall harder. The sky dimmed another shade. Jack crawled into the tent, zipped the flap shut, and lit the small stove. A faint ring of warmth spread through the cramped space. His hands hovered over the flame, fingers tingling painfully as feeling returned. Outside, the storm gathered strength. The wind struck the tent in hard, rhythmic bursts, making the canvas shudder against the poles. The sound was loud but not frightening. It felt like an old, massive world shifting itself back into place. Jack lay back in his sleeping bag, listening. His body was exhausted in a way that went beyond the climb and the cold. It felt like something had been pouring out of him for days. Guilt, awe, responsibility. And now there was finally room for a different feeling. Peace. He thought of Ethan, of the station, of the avalanche of headlines he knew was already blanketing the world. He imagined the logbook under glass someday, people crowding around it, whispering. He imagined a child staring at a photograph of the Resolute and feeling that first electric spark of wonder. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was what someone someday really meant. Outside, the wind screamed louder, then faded, then rose again in a long, drawn-out howl. The temperature inside the tent fell, even with the stove. The thin walls trembled, but held. Jack's eyes grew heavy. He thought of the crew again, standing on that airship deck staring down at endless ocean, knowing they'd done something the world wasn't ready to believe. He imagined walking among them, telling them that one day people would speak their names again. He smiled faintly at the thought. "Rest easy," he murmured, though no one was there to hear. The storm raged on. At some point in the long, frozen hours that followed, the wind smoothed out into a constant roar, and the temperature dropped even further. Ice crept over every surface, tightening its grip around tent and hull and plaque and man. When the world finally grew quiet again, Jack Whitmore lay still inside his sleeping bag, his expression peaceful, his body surrendered to a cold that no one could outwalk. Days later, when Ethan's worry finally overturned habit and pride, rescue teams were organized. The weather fought them every step of the way. They battled whiteouts, treacherous slopes, and the unsteady moods of the glacier itself. They found the tent still standing. Near it, half covered in snow, stood the plaque. Its letters clear and sharp, the names carved deep enough that even the ice hadn't yet blurred them. Beyond, the faint shape of the Resolute's hull curved under its frozen shroud. Inside the tent, they found Jack. His body lay as if asleep, hands relaxed, face calm. There was no sign of struggle, no panic frozen in his features. The rescue team worked in strained silence, as if they'd stumbled into a place that didn't belong entirely to the living. One of them found the recorder inside his jacket. The final file was intact. Back at the station, Ethan listened alone. Jack's voice filled the small room, steady, quiet, carrying the same stubborn warmth it always had. "If anyone finds this, tell them we kept the promise. They weren't forgotten." The message ended with the soft, endless sound of wind. Months later, the story of the HMS Resolute and the man who found it had wrapped itself around the world. In Fairbanks, they built Resolute Memorial Hall, a long vaulted building of glass and steel that caught the winter light and turned it into something almost gentle. Inside the main chamber, suspended from the ceiling, hung a full-scale model of the airship Silver, and elegant, a ghost given shape. Around it, under glass, lay the preserved flight log, the blueprints, the letters, and a printed copy of the plaque Jack had left on the glacier. The real plaque remained where he had placed it, far away, frozen into the ice. On the night of the dedication, the hall was full. Researchers, officials, locals who had watched the whole thing unfold from a distance and somehow felt a part of it. Cameras recorded the event, but the room felt oddly intimate, like a confession rather than a show. Ethan stepped up to the podium. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone. Behind him, projected on a tall screen, was a photograph of the plaque on the Glacier Jack's gloves, visible at the edge of the frame. "They dreamed of crossing the ocean," Ethan began, his voice rough around the edges. "Captain Hargrove and his crew. They risked everything because they believed the sky could carry them farther than anyone thought possible. He paused, eyes moving to the image of the airship above them. Jack dreamed of finding them, he continued, of making sure their story didn't stay buried under ice and silence. He wanted the world to know what they did, but he also wanted us to remember what this place was, not just a historic site, not just an artifact. He swallowed hard. A grave, he said softly. A resting place for men who tried to do the impossible. He looked out at the audience, at faces turned toward him in perfect stillness. In the end, Ethan said, all of them reached the other side, the crew of the Resolute, who crossed the ocean before the world was ready to believe, and Jack, who made sure their voices were finally heard. The hall was silent for several long seconds. Then, slowly, people stood, not with cheers, not with wild applause, with something closer to reverence. Outside, snow drifted quietly over the city streets, softening lights and edges, blurring the line between earth and sky. Far beyond the buildings and roads, the mountains rose, white and cold and eternal. Up there, the glacier stretched on, indifferent to headlines and broadcasts. The wreck of the HMS Resolute slept again beneath its surface, the plaque frozen upright nearby, the names on it facing the endless sky. Sometimes when the wind moved across the peaks just right, people in the valley said they heard something strange on the air. A faint, distant hum, too steady to be weather, too soft to be machinery, like engines turning over, like a vessel still pushing through invisible air. As if somewhere beyond time and ice, an old airship still crossed the sky, carrying the memory of the men who dared and the man who found them. The story, after all, had never really been about glory. It had always been about this, that some dreams are too big to die. They just wait, buried, frozen, until someone brave enough is willing to listen. And when the past finally speaks, the only question that matters is the one waiting for those who hear it. What will you do now that you know? The HMS Resolute sleeps once more beneath the ice, but its story is only beginning. What would you do if the past rose from the frozen silence? Subscribe, like the video, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. More mysteries are coming. Don't miss the next one.